ultimate burnout. Li Wei did not go out in a blaze of glory. There was no speeding truck, no heroic sacrifice, no dramatic final words. He died the thoroughly modern, deeply tragic corporate way, slumped over a mahogany desk at 3:14 a.m. As the director of global logistics for a massive conglomerate, Li Wei was running on his fifth consecutive 100-hour workweek. He was staring at an endless, blindingly white Excel spreadsheet, trying to reconcile a multi-million-dollar shipping discrepancy when a sharp, cold, agonizing weight crushed his chest. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. The only sound in his final moments was the relentless, mocking blink of his cursor. Click, blink, fade to black. When Li Wei gasped for air again, his lungs didn't fill with the sterile, heavily filtered air conditioning of a high-rise office. They filled with the biting, freezing chill of late autumn and the heavy scent of mildew, rotting damp wood, and cheap, burnt incense. He wasn't sitting in an ergonomic chair. He was shivering on a cracked, freezing stone floor. Li Wei forced his heavy eyelids open. Instead of the glittering skyline of the financial district, he was greeted by peeling vermilion pillars, torn paper windows rattling in the wind, and the pale, unforgiving light of a full moon. Before he could even process the sheer absurdity of his surroundings, a violent surge of alien memories crashed into his brain like a corrupted hard drive downloading directly into his skull. He knew exactly where he was, or rather, who he was. He had transmigrated into the world of the Emperor's Beloved, a wildly melodramatic, trashy palace intrigue novel his younger sister had practically forced him to read last month. But he wasn't the heroic emperor, nor the pure-hearted protagonist. He was Lin Mochen. In the novel, Lin Mochen was the ultimate tragic villain, a male concubine of stunning beauty, but supposedly vicious temperament. The memories painted a pathetic picture. Mochen had been elevated to the inner court merely to act as a political meat shield for the emperor's actual favorite. When a clumsy assassination attempt via poison lotus soup occurred, the true culprits easily framed the unpopular, hot-tempered Mochen. The court universally despised him. The emperor, who had never touched him to begin with, threw him away without a second thought. Stripped of his titles, Mochen was banished to the desolate, cold palace. The imperial edict had been delivered only hours ago. Mochen was to be granted the mercy of a quiet execution by poisoned wine in exactly 90 days, giving him just enough time to repent for his sins in isolation. The original Lin Mochen had spent the last 3 hours sobbing violently, clawing his perfectly manicured nails bloody against the locked courtyard doors, begging for an audience with an emperor who wanted him dead. He had cried until his weak heart had simply given out from the despair. Li Wei sat up slowly, his joints aching. He looked down at his hands, slender, pale, lacking the familiar calluses of a man who typed for a living. He was wearing thin, soiled silk robes that provided absolutely no protection against the biting draft. For a long moment, the former executive just sat in the deafening silence of the ancient, decaying room. A lesser man might have panicked. A normal man would have cried. Li Wei simply let out a long, exhausted sigh, reached up and tightened the silk robe securely around his shivering shoulders. "Crying is a terrible waste of hydration," he muttered, his voice raspy and unfamiliar to his own ears. He pushed himself off the freezing floor and began a calm, methodical sweep of his new office. Inventory check, his mind hummed automatically. He had a broken porcelain teacup, a thin wool blanket that smelled like dust, and, hidden beneath a loose floorboard by his predecessor, 3 moderately valuable jade hairpins. Finally, he walked over to the dead hearth. He picked up a piece of cold, charred firewood, weighing it in his hand like a prize fountain pen. He turned to the largest stretch of unbroken, peeling plaster wall in the room. With sharp, decisive strokes, he drew a massive, perfectly straight T-chart. On the left, assets. On the right, liabilities. 90 days, Mochen whispered to the empty room, a dangerous, calculating gleam replacing the despair that had previously clouded those beautiful eyes. "I've liquidated failing, bloated multinational corporations in 60, A feudal state run by an incompetent, narcissistic nepotism baby? He scratched his first logistical variable onto the wall. Let's see how long this pathetic dynasty survives a hostile takeover. Chapter 2. The Cold Palace Supply Chain. Emperor Zhao Tianzi was the feudal equivalent of a textbook, narcissistic CEO who had inherited a Fortune 500 company and was running it straight into the ground. While the northern borders bled and the southern provinces faced severe famine, the emperor was busy authorizing expenditures for gold-leafed lotus pavilions, exotic peacocks, and lavish banquets that wasted enough meat in a single night to feed a battalion. To Li Wei, now Lin Mochen, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a gross misallocation of capital, and it made his blood boil. Mochen began his hostile takeover at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder, his own jailers. On his third day in the Cold Palace, a sneering, low-ranking attendant named Eunuch Gao slid a bowl of rancid, watered-down gruel through the slot in the door. Gao waited for the usual routine, the disgraced concubine crying, throwing the bowl, and begging for a scrap of real meat. Instead, a pale, perfectly calm hand slid one of the 3 hidden jade hairpins through the slot. It was worth more than Gao made in a year. "I don't want your food." Mochen's voice was smooth, carrying the undeniable authority of a man used to commanding boardrooms. "I want a brush, ink, and the daily procurement logs from the imperial kitchens. I also want the current market price of winter cabbage, charcoal, and coarse salt in the capital's outer ring." Eunuch Gao blinked, stunned, but greed quickly won out. By midnight, Mochen had his data. For the next week, the walls of the Cold Palace became a massive charcoal-drawn spreadsheet. Mochen worked feverishly, cross-referencing the kitchen logs with the outer market prices. He immediately spotted the leak. The Imperial Household Department, the palace's procurement division, was catastrophically corrupt. Senior officials were buying cheap, low-grade supplies, charging the imperial treasury premium rates, and pocketing the massive difference. But it was the lower servants, the guards, the scullery maids, the minor eunuchs like Gao, who suffered. They were severely underpaid, their wages often delayed, leaving them completely vulnerable to the brutal winter price gouging of the capital's merchants. Mochen saw his opening. He didn't need to overthrow the emperor yet. He just needed to monopolize the servants. Calling Eunuch Gao back, Mochen laid out a proposition. He introduced a concept entirely alien to the ancient world: futures contracts. Winter is coming and the merchants will triple the price of charcoal next month. Mochen explained to the skeptical eunuch, using his last 2 jade hairpins as collateral. "Give me your meager wages now. I will issue you a promissory note, a contract. I guarantee you will receive your winter charcoal and cabbage at today's prices, regardless of how high the market spikes next month." It was a gamble, but the servants were desperate. Word spread through the servants' quarters like wildfire. Mochen pooled their fractional copper coins, combined them with the value of his jade, and used Gao to quietly buy massive bulk orders of necessities directly from the wholesalers, completely bypassing the corrupt palace middlemen. By week 3, Mochen had pulled off a logistical miracle. He had created a shadow economy within the palace walls. The promissory notes, slips of cheap bamboo bearing Mochen's elegant calligraphy, became the new currency among the lower ranks. He wasn't their prisoner anymore. He was their broker, their bank, and their only defense against freezing to death. The eunuchs began sneaking him premium hot meals, extra blankets, and vital political gossip, treating him with more reverence than they treated the emperor. But a market that expands too quickly inevitably attracts the attention of regulators. Mochen's network had grown so efficient that his buyers accidentally intercepted a highly lucrative illicit shipment, military-grade grain that corrupt officials were trying to smuggle into the palace for a profit. Mochen was sitting on his bed, reviewing a stack of bamboo slips by the light of a high-quality beeswax candle, when the courtyard suddenly fell deathly silent. The crickets stopped chirping. The eunuch guarding the gate let out a choked gasp before a heavy thud echoed through the night. Crack. The rotting wooden doors of Mochen's quarters were violently kicked completely off their hinges, sending a cloud of dust and splinters into the room. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight and clad in heavy blood-stained iron armor, was Shen Tingye, the dreaded, undefeated general of the Imperial Army, and he looked absolutely murderous. Chapter 3. The General's Audit. Shen Tingye was a man forged in the brutal crucible of war. At 26, he was already the most feared military commander in the empire, known as much for his absolute devotion to his soldiers as he was for his lethal prowess on the battlefield. Right now, however, the general was not facing a foreign army. He was standing in the crumbling remains of a palace doorway, radiating a suffocating, blood-chilling aura. He had spent the last 3 days tracking a massive, inexplicable discrepancy in the winter grain allocation meant for his northern vanguard. His investigation had bypassed the usual corrupt ministers and led him, bewilderingly, to the heavily guarded, decaying courtyard of the emperor's discarded male concubine. Shen Tingye stepped into the room, his heavy iron boots crunching over the splintered wood. He drew his sword, a massive blade of dark, tempered steel, with a sharp shing that echoed in the quiet room. In one fluid motion, the cold edge of the blade came to rest a hair's breadth from Lin Mochen's pale throat. "You are supposed to be weeping in repentance, Consort Lin." Shen Tingye's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, carrying the distinct scent of cold iron and winter frost. "Instead, I find you hoarding military-grade rations while my men freeze. Give me one reason not to separate your beautiful head from your shoulders right now." Shen Tingye expected tears. He expected the notorious, brainless, jealous viper of the inner court to fall to his knees and beg. Instead, Mochen didn't even flinch. He didn't cower. The former logistics director merely let out a quiet sigh, carefully set his calligraphy brush on its resting stone so as not to stain the bamboo slips, and slowly looked up. His eyes were incredibly calm, dark, and terrifyingly sharp. "If you cut off my head, General Shen," Mochen said, his voice entirely steady, "you will never find the 40% of your supply chain that is currently bleeding into the pockets of the provincial governors." Shen Tingye's eyes narrowed. The blade did not move, but his grip tightened. "Speak clearly." Using 2 fingers, Mochen gently pushed the flat of the sword away from his jugular. He picked up a densely packed sheet of parchment and extended it toward the towering general. "You aren't missing grain because of me. You are missing grain because your quartermasters are skimming 20% in Jiangnan. Another 15% is miraculously lost to spoilage during the Yellow River transport. By the time it reaches the capital, the Ministry of Revenue is replacing the remaining good grain with sand-mixed chaff and selling the premium surplus on the black market." Shen Tingye snatched the parchment. His eyes scanned the immaculate, razor-sharp calculations. It was a complete, devastating audit of his own military logistics, detailing routes, prices, and the exact names of the officials skimming off the top. It was data that his own spies had failed to uncover in months, plotted out flawlessly by a man locked in a prison cell. "I didn't steal your rations, General," Mochen continued, leaning back slightly, crossing his arms like a CEO in a boardroom negotiation. "I intercepted a back-alley sale from those corrupt capital officials. I used the localized economy I built among the servants to buy it out from under them at a fraction of the cost. I am currently shorting the very merchants who are starving your men." Shen Tingye stared at the fragile, striking man sitting before him. The rumors painted Lin Mochen as a hysterical, useless concubine, but the man looking back at him was a predator of a different breed, a master tactician who wielded mathematics and ledgers like weapons of war. "Why?" Shen Tingye demanded, his voice losing its murderous edge, replaced by intense fascination. "You are condemned to die in less than 70 days. Why involve yourself in the military's ledgers?" "Because a bad manager deserves to be fired, and this empire is catastrophically mismanaged," Mochen replied coldly. Then his tone softened, turning pragmatic. "And because I need leverage. You have the military might, I have the logistical genius. Shield me from the Emperor's executioners. Provide me with a steady stream of capital and unrestricted market data." Mochen stood up, closing the distance between them, entirely unafraid of the imposing warrior. Do this, Mochen promised, his eyes locking fiercely with Shen Tingye's. And I will not just fix your broken supply lines. I will increase your army's provisions by 50% before the first snowfall, fully funded, without touching a single copper coin of the emperor's treasury. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was silent, save for the howling wind outside. Shen Tingye looked at the impossible calculations in his hand, and then down at the breathtaking, brilliant strategist who had drafted them. With a sharp snap, Shen Tingye sheathed his heavy sword. 50% consort Lin, the general said, a slow, dangerous smile finally touching the corners of his lips. If you fail, I will pour the emperor's poisoned wine down your throat myself. But if you succeed, you will have the entire imperial army standing between you and the executioner's block. The contract was sealed, and the empire's days were officially numbered. Chapter 4. The Hostile Takeover. The alliance between the disgraced concubine and the supreme military commander began as a cold, calculated transaction. But within weeks, the crumbling walls of the cold palace were transformed into the secret nerve center of a nationwide economic rebellion. General Shen Tingye provided the capital, funneling his personal wealth and the military's off-the-books funds into Mochen's hands. He also provided the muscle, utilizing his most loyal, disguised lieutenants as Mochen's physical brokers in the capital. Mochen, operating entirely from the shadows of his freezing prison, provided the ruthless, unparalleled genius. Together, they launched a devastatingly quiet, three-pronged hostile takeover of Emperor Zhao Tianzi's empire. Cornering the state monopolies, Mochen explicitly ignored luxury goods like silk and jade, knowing the emperor would hoard them anyway. Instead, he used Shen's silver to aggressively buy up futures in raw iron and coarse salt, the absolute essentials for survival. By controlling the supply at the source, Mochen dictated the market. When the corrupt provincial ministers tried to buy their winter supplies, they found the markets dry, forcing them to buy from Mochen's shadow brokers at a staggering premium. The currency squeeze. The emperor had been funding his lavish lifestyle by minting highly debased, lightweight copper coins, practically stealing from the commoners. Mochen weaponized this. He ordered Shen's men to flood the capital's black markets with these cheap copper coins, aggressively trading them for solid silver ingots and hiding the silver in military vaults. This triggered localized hyperinflation. The emperor's copper became practically worthless overnight, crippling the imperial treasury's spending power. The shadow welfare system. As the winter grew brutal and the emperor's inflation starved the outer rings of the capital, Mochen struck his final blow for public relations. He instructed Shen Tingye's troops to set up relief stations. They didn't just give away food. Mochen established subsidized markets where commoners could buy Mochen's hoarded grain and coal at strictly regulated, affordable prices. To the public eye, Emperor Zhao Tianzi was a tyrant starving them with worthless coins, while General Shen Tingye's army was their sole salvation. The mandate of heaven didn't just slip from the emperor's grasp. Mochen systematically liquidated it. But the true transformation during these long winter months happened behind the locked doors of the cold palace. Shen Tingye became a constant, looming fixture in Mochen's life. He would arrive deep in the night, slipping past the guards like a shadow, shedding his snow-covered armor at the door. He brought intelligence reports and market data, but he also brought things entirely unrelated to their war. A brass hand warmer filled with premium smokeless coal, a thick silver fox fur cloak, and thermoses of medicinal ginger tea. Shen Tingye would sit in quiet awe, watching Mochen work. The general had seen men wield spears and arrows with deadly precision, but nothing compared to the lethal grace of Lin Mochen's mind. Mochen's fingers flew over his abacus, his calligraphy brush darting across the ledgers, systematically dismantling an entire dynasty to ensure the poorest families in the slums could afford a bowl of rice. The vicious, brainless concubine of the rumors was a ghost. The man before him was a savior, cloaked in the guise of a ruthless accountant. Shen Tingye realized he was no longer just protecting a strategic military asset. He was falling deeply, irrevocably in love. One particularly brutal night, The blizzard howling outside rattled the paper windows. Mochen was slumped over a massive map of the southern trade routes, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, a smudge of black ink staining his pale cheek. Shen Tingye crossed the room. Without a word, he gently took the calligraphy brush from Mochen's stiff, freezing fingers. He set it aside, then enveloped Mochen's cold hands within his own massive, calloused, battle-scarred ones, rubbing warmth back into the slender fingers. "You need to sleep, Mochen." The general's voice was a low, tender rumble in the quiet room. "The southern grain routes can wait until sunrise." "Time is money, General," Mochen murmured, though he didn't pull his hands away. Instead, he leaned his head back, resting it against the solid, immovable warmth of Shen Tingye's chest. For a man who had spent 2 lifetimes carrying the weight of massive organizations alone, the realization that he was entirely safe, that someone else was finally watching his back, was intoxicating. "If I don't balance the deficit in Jiangnan by tomorrow, your vanguard will face a 10% ration cut." Shen Tingye gently turned Mochen around to face him. He reached up, his thumb tenderly brushing the ink smudge from Mochen's cheek. The touch was impossibly gentle for a man who commanded legions. "Time is not money. Time is your life," Shen Tingye corrected softly, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made Mochen's breath catch. "And your life belongs to me now. Let the Emperor's ledgers bleed. Let the Empire burn to the ground if it must." Shen Tingye leaned down, pressing his lips to Mochen's forehead, then trailing down to capture his lips in a slow, grounding kiss that tasted of ginger tea and absolute devotion. "I will build you a new world from the ashes," the general whispered against Mochen's lips. "Just tell me where to strike." Chapter 5. The Boardroom Coup. Day 90 arrived, the deadline. Inside the golden Luan Hall, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of ambergris and roasting meats. Emperor Zhao Tianze lounged on the dragon throne, draped in layers of heavy gold silk, casually dropping peeled grapes into his mouth. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that his kingdom currently existed only as ink on Lin Mochen's hidden bamboo slips. "It is noon," the emperor drawled, waving a lazy hand toward the head eunuch. "Go to the cold palace. Ensure that wretched Lin Mochen drinks every last drop of the poison wine. I want his corpse thrown into the mass graves before sunset." The head eunuch dropped to his knees, his entire body trembling so violently his hat nearly fell off. Your Majesty, I cannot. The Imperial Guards, they are gone. The gates to the inner palace are completely unmanned." Zhao Tianze sat up, a frown marring his pampered face. "What do you mean unmanned? Are they deaf? Summon General Shen Tingye." As if summoned by the emperor's rising panic, the massive brass-studded doors of the throne room did not just open, they were violently thrown wide, slamming against the stone walls with a deafening crash. A brutal gust of winter wind swept through the grand hall, extinguishing the incense burners and sending the terrified court ministers scrambling back. The rhythmic, synchronized thud of heavy iron boots echoed through the cavernous space. Shen Tingye strode into the hall. He was clad in his full, terrifying ceremonial armor, a literal god of war radiating lethal authority. The elite guards stationed inside the throne room did not draw their weapons to stop the intruder. Instead, in perfect unison, they dropped to one knee, bowing their heads to the general. But it was the man walking beside Shen Tingye that stole the breath from the entire court. Gone were the soiled, ragged silks of the condemned concubine. Lin Mochen stepped over the threshold dressed in magnificent, sweeping robes of deep obsidian brocade, heavily embroidered with silver thread that caught the cold winter light. His posture was perfectly straight, his raven hair pinned flawlessly with a single sharp silver guan. He didn't look like a disgraced consort, he looked like the true sovereign of the world. "Treason!" Emperor Zhao Tianze shrieked, his voice cracking as he scrambled to his feet, kicking over his table of delicacies. "Shen Tingye, you dare bring that condemned whore into my hall? Guards, kill them! Kill them both!" Nobody moved. The silence in the throne room was absolute, broken only by the steady, measured clicks of Lin Mochen's leather boots as he walked up the central aisle, stopping right at the base of the jade steps leading to the throne. "There is no treason here, Zhao Tianzi." Mochen's voice rang out, crisp, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. It was the voice of a senior director addressing a failing intern. Only a margin call. Mochen reached into his sleeve and pulled out a massive, tightly bound ledger. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it. The heavy book landed with a resounding thwack right at the emperor's feet. "Your treasury is entirely empty," Mochen declared, his dark eyes locking onto the trembling emperor. "The merchants across the capital refuse to accept your debased currency. The military is funded completely by my private logistical accounts, and the citizens answer only to General Shen's relief camps. You have zero liquid assets, zero public approval, and zero power." Zhao Tianzi stared at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. I am the son of heaven. The empire belongs to me." "The empire belongs to the supply chain," Mochen corrected coldly, "and I own the supply chain. You aren't an emperor anymore. You are a bankrupt liability, and I am foreclosing on this dynasty." "Arrest him!" the emperor screamed at the silent court ministers. "He is just a concubine." Shen Tingye finally stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his massive sword. The subtle, lethal threat in his posture made the nearest ministers physically recoil. "He is the architect of this nation's survival," Shen Tingye's voice boomed, leaving no room for argument. "He fed my army when you let them freeze. He fed your people when you let them starve. Anyone who speaks a word against him will answer to my blade." The hostile takeover was entirely bloodless. There were no grand battles, no dramatic sword fights. Zhao Tianzi collapsed back onto his golden throne, his face ashen, looking at the dozens of ministers and guards who kept their eyes firmly glued to the floor. He had not been conquered by an invading army. He had been meticulously, flawlessly audited out of existence by the very man he had thrown away. Epilogue. Dividends of a new dynasty. The transition of power was as brutally efficient as one of Lin Mochen's flawless spreadsheets. Zhao Tianzi was formally stripped of his imperial titles, his heavy gold silks replaced with coarse, scratchy hemp. There was no grand execution or public beheading. Mochen considered such displays an unnecessary waste of state resources. Instead, the former emperor was exiled to a remote, barren farming commune in the harsh northern provinces. His permanent imperial decree? He was legally required to learn double-entry bookkeeping and would only be allowed to eat the exact yield of cabbages he could personally cultivate and correctly log. It was a karmic corporate punishment that left the former tyrant weeping harder than any torture could. With the dragon throne suddenly empty, the terrified court ministers naturally looked to the man holding the sword. Shen Tingye had the absolute loyalty of the military, the noble lineage, and the terrifying presence of a conqueror. On the day of the formal ascension, the grand ministers gathered in the golden Luan Hall, heads bowed, offering the heavy jade imperial seal to the towering general. Shen Tingye took the seal in his massive, battle-scarred hand. He looked at the intricately carved jade, then walked right past the groveling ministers. He stopped at the base of the dais where Lin Mochen stood. Mochen was breathtaking in his dark, silver-threaded robes, watching the general with a soft, knowing gaze. To the absolute shock of the entire assembled court, the undefeated god of war descended to one knee, bowing his head not to the heavens, but to the disgraced former concubine. An army can tear down a rotting foundation, and a sword can conquer a city. Shen Tingye's voice resonated through the silent hall, vibrating with absolute, unwavering devotion. He held the imperial seal up, offering it to Mochen. "But only a true visionary can build a world where the people thrive. You did not just save my men, you saved this empire's soul. My blade, my legions, and my heart belong entirely to you." The court held its collective breath. Mochen looked down at the fearsome warrior kneeling before him. For 2 lifetimes, Mochen had built walls around himself, viewing the world strictly through the cold, calculated lens of assets, liabilities, and profit margins. But looking at Shen Tingye, Mochen felt the last remnants of his icy corporate exterior melt away entirely. He didn't just see a general, he saw his partner, his protector, and his home. Mochen stepped down from the dais. He didn't take the seal. Instead, he reached out with both hands and gently took Shen Tingye's face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw before pulling the massive general up to his feet. I have spent my entire life managing failing enterprises alone, Mochen said, a genuine radiant smile breaking across his face, a sight so beautiful it made Shen Tingye's breath catch. I do not accept sole proprietorship, Shen Tingye. If I am to rule this empire, you will sit beside me, equal partners, in this life and all the ones that follow. Shen Tingye's eyes darkened with overwhelming love. Right there, in front of the stunned bureaucracy of the highest court, the general wrapped his arms around Mochen's waist, pulling him flush against his chest, and kissed him, a deep, passionate promise sealed in front of the world. When Emperor Lin Mochen officially ascended the Dragon Throne, a second throne of equal height and splendor was placed directly beside his, occupied by the newly crowned co-emperor, Shen Tingye. Together they built a golden age unparalleled in history. It was a dynasty not forged on fear, nepotism, or lavish excess, but on flawlessly optimized infrastructure, subsidized public education, and a booming, meticulously regulated free market. The former overworked office drone had finally achieved the ultimate elusive dream, the perfect work-life balance. By day, they ran a prosperous, untouchable empire. By night, Mochen slept soundly, wrapped entirely in the warm, fiercely protective arms of the man who loved him. And as for the kingdom's grand ledgers, for the first time in a century, there was zero deficit. Every account was perfectly, beautifully balanced.